In any event, let's start our business of today. Um, Today we're going to talk about monopoly and oligopoly. Okay, monopoly and oligopoly. Now, in the economic system, we have four kinds of market structures. We have just a minute, just a minute. We have four kinds of market structures. You have perfect competition, we have monopoly, we have imperfect competition, or what we call monopolistic competition, and then we have oligopoly. Now, monopoly and oligopoly are similar, and perfect competition and imperfect competition, or what we call monopolistic competition, um, are similar. Nevertheless, these are the four main market structures. Now, I would define monopoly. Well, let me define perfect competition for us. And the perfect competition that we talked about the last time is where you have numerous sellers in the market selling exactly identical products. There are no barriers to entry. Firms go in, come out. There are numerous buyers. Once the market sets the price, every seller must sell at that price. That's what perfect competition is. At the opposite end is pure monopoly, where you have one and only one seller in the market. Okay? The perfectly competitive firm faces a single price, and the seller can sell an infinite number of quantities provided they stay at the price set by the market. And so what you have is a flat demand curve, where marginal revenue is equal to price. Now, on the other extreme is where you have a single seller in the market, and this single seller sells a product for which there are no substitutes, and the single seller faces a downward sloping demand curve. If the seller wants to sell a larger quantity of their product, then they must reduce the price. Okay. Now, as we move forward, we're going to ask ourselves, what are the conditions for equilibrium in monopoly market? What are the conditions for equilibrium and for profit maximizing the firm? The basic condition for profit maximization in any market system is where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. But there are differences in what the outcomes would be for a monopolist and perfectly competitive firm. Now, why do monopolies exist? Okay. Now, monopolies exist where the firm that is the only seller has control of scarce resources, in the sense that if a firm has control of scarce resources, then a monopoly is possible. Okay? It could be a mineral resource where there's only one source of that mineral resource, and there's this firm that controls it. Okay. Now, it could also be technology. This one firm knows this technology, and no other firm knows the technology, and so They produce the good that's produced through that technology. There are no other substitutes. Uh, and so they are able to exert the monopoly influence in the market, which you see here as technological superiority. Now, we'll talk about increasing returns to scale. I would like to modify exactly what this means in the sense that increasing returns to scale is such that the larger the quantity you produce, the lower the average cost of production. And how this affects or leads to monopoly is simply that for certain products, in order to produce them, given the size of the market, you need to produce in large quantities, or the technology to produce them is such that you need to invest substantial amounts of money, and that creates to um, a barrier to entry for any other firm. Okay, if the market is not that big, then a certain minimum quantity will be required to be able to operate in the market. Okay, and sometimes, well, in the past, I would say governments create barriers. Create barriers to entry by using licensing. Um, or it was when, for example, the telecommunication system. Many of you uh, were not yet around when, for example, AT&T was the only long distance telephone company. And this was quite simply because the technology for long distance telephones was, quite expensive to create. And so government allowed monopoly. The railway system was another system way back in the past, again, due to substantial requirement for capital. So railway systems were monopolies. Okay. But also the idea that allowing competition could also create what you might call obstacles and confrontations. For example, if you allowed many companies to provide water in New York City, then you have all kinds of different types, going from here to there and people competing. And so you have obstructions in the system. And so companies are granted monopolies. But even when AT&T and the power companies were granted monopolies, and even today, the power companies that provide gas and electricity are essentially government-regulated monopolies. Before they raise price, they have to come and present a case, and so um, they are allowed to be monopolies, but they are regulated monopolies. Again, monopolies exist when the value of a good or service to an individual is greater than when many other people use the good or service. For example, Microsoft. Um, when I say Microsoft, I'm talking about the software, from when we had the DOS system, the disk operating system, when now we have Windows. And so suppose you had all these different kinds of operating systems to operate computers. You will see that you would have a serious problem because if you buy a computer with one operating system, you may not be able to use another person's computer, or you may not be able to download software from another person's computer because they are using a different language, and so you see that Microsoft Windows, or DOS, the disk operating system as it was called many years ago, essentially Microsoft becomes the monopoly. Okay, and the story of how Microsoft became the monopoly is a very long story, not something that is we're able to tell here, given the time constraints, and of course limited knowledge of exactly what it was, and so um, it's like we have to speak different languages, and so you can see, for example, English is a dominant language. wherever you go in this world, I'm surprised that a lot of people try to learn the English language. So the Microsoft Windows is like a language, and it's better for each individual if we all speak that language so that we can exchange information across computers. So that essentially creates a monopoly. Microsoft has been sued over time for creating a monopoly because this is what happened over time with Microsoft. Now, many years ago, and I'm saying about 40 years ago, 35 years ago, you had different kinds of, say, word processors for spreadsheets. I use Lotus 123. I use Q. I use some other kinds of spreadsheets and word processors that you know were based on DOS, but you can see that over time, Microsoft Word or Microsoft simply took over everything from spreadsheets to databases to you name it. Databases used to have DBase 3. They were based on Microsoft DOS. Nevertheless, they operated differently, and Microsoft simply drove them all of them out of the market. So MS Word, MS Excel, um, and the database software, I don't even know Microsoft software for database is called now. Microsoft took over everything, okay? Because it was difficult 30 years ago, 35 years ago, even, yeah, about 30, 35 years ago, up to 40 years ago, for me to write something in Word Perfect and be able to transfer it to another word processor. Okay, we had WordStar, we had WordPerfect, and I used to use what was called Professional Write. It was very difficult to give somebody something that you do in a Professional Write and give it to somebody who had WordPerfect. And there were attempts, for these different softwares in word processing to find a way to, translate between one and another. Microsoft made it very difficult for you to be able to do that. So everybody eventually turned to Microsoft softwares, including word processing, including Excel, including database, including publishing, you name it. So these are, some of the stories that explain how monopolies exist. Okay. Now, the question is already answered. How does a firm obtain monopoly power? Barriers to entry make it difficult. The amount of capital needed to enter, or the technology that is, unique to a business. Uh, these are, examples of barriers to entry. Uh, all right. I mean, what you see me going through essentially is a story, the same story, okay? Some story that I'd already told. So, um, and I provided the examples of these conditions um, that uh, uh, give rise to monopoly in the industry. Now, the monopoly faces an industry demand curve in the sense that uh, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve instead of a flat demand curve. And I explained earlier that in perfect competition, the firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve, which is a flat demand curve. Okay. And marginal revenue is the same thing as average revenue, but a monopolist is different. And I'm trying to see where we um, provide illustration in the form of a graph. Like I said earlier, if the monopolist wants to sell more, they have to lower the price. The question is, how would they, at what point would they stop lowering price? I can see the downward sloping demand curve is a monopolist demand curve. Okay. All right. I'll keep going. Now, when a monopolist raises price, the quantity demanded falls. Okay. And it depends on the price elasticity of demand. The question is, how far will the monopolists continue to reduce price in order to sell more? And the answer will be that it all depends on the cost of production. I'm trying to get to the point. As you can see from this table, okay, the monopolist says 0 units, okay. If the price is $8, and as the monopolist wants to sell more, they have to keep reducing price, okay? And so at the price of, $8, nothing is sold, okay? You look at the cost here, and this table will explain to us at what point the monopolist, all right. So can see here that if the monopolist wants to sell more, they have to reduce price. And so the marginal revenue for the monopolist is downward sloping and always below the demand curve. This demand curve that's in blue is the average price, okay? So at a price of say $7, the monopolist will sell 5 units, okay? Okay, at a price of $6, the monopolist will sell 9.5 units. Okay. Now, but as the monopolist is reducing price, the marginal revenue declines. For example, if the monopolist charges $7, they will sell 5 units. Now, if they they want to increase sales by 1 more unit. Now, if you have to reduce price, then the additional revenue for selling that 1 extra unit is going to be less than $7, and that is what we call the marginal revenue. So the marginal revenue becomes less than the previous price. And so this is why the marginal revenue curve is below. Now, as we can see from this table here, the price of 5 units are sold, okay? The total revenue is 35, but the total cost, let's see, the marginal cost is $2.80, okay? And so if the price is, say, $6, they sell 10 units, and you can see the marginal cost is $4.40. But then after that, the marginal cost begins to rise. And so this is what you see here. The marginal cost falls and then begins to rise. The monopolists will maximize profit at the point where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue. And so the quantity that maximizes profit is at 9.5 units. So now, like in perfect competition, the difference is that this demand curve will be flat. And so the average price is also the same thing as the marginal revenue. Now, what happens then is that this marginal cost that falls and rises will meet the marginal revenue curve up there, okay, at a higher point, which of course means that a larger quantity will be sold. So, yeah, but the condition for profit maximization is the same whether you have a monopoly or you have perfect competition, except that the marginal revenue of the monopolies is downward sloping and therefore catches the marginal cost at a lower quantity of output. As you can see it here in this graph here on the left-hand side, where you can see the point of profit maximization of the monopolist. Okay. Now, if the monopolist, you can see here in this chart here, again, the marginal cost comes from below to cut and meet the marginal revenue. If the monopolist sells at a price below where marginal cost is below marginal revenue, um, sorry, if the monopoly sells at a point where marginal cost is below marginal revenue, they're not maximizing their profit. They are making a profit, but they are not maximizing their profit. They have to keep going. If they sell at a price where marginal cost is above marginal revenue, they will not also be maximizing profit because marginal cost is higher than the marginal revenue. In a sense, if the additional cost of producing is higher than the additional revenue you make, it makes a lot of common sense that the producer will not be producing. Now, where the marginal cost is below marginal revenue, yes, it makes sense to produce more because the marginal revenue is higher than the marginal cost, and so you take in the additional profit.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Okay. Now, the other market structure is oligopoly. Okay. Oligopoly. Oligopoly is where there are few sellers, very few sellers, like 3 or 4 sellers in the market. For a long time, the automobile industry in the United States essentially has been an oligopoly. Way back in the 1970s and 1980s, how many car companies did we have in America? We had Chrysler, we had AMC, we had Ford, and we had GM. Uh, Before that, we had Studebaker. I don't know how many of you are old enough to witness the Studebaker. I'm talking about the late 1950s. You had a car company called Studebaker. By the 1970s, the AMC was gone. In fact, I had in 1977, I bought an AMC, and those were one of the last AMCs, and the AMC was very strong. I guess maybe it was just a marketing issue. My AMC was a very strong car, and I drove it for a very long time. But there are um, a few sellers, a very small number of sellers. Okay. And the strategy used in oligopoly depends on the objectives of the firms. Now, you can remember that in oligopoly, there is collusion, okay, in the sense that the very few firms can get together and try to collude to control quantities and to control prices, and sometimes they share, they have a predetermined um, distribution of quantities sold, and but then it's very difficult to maintain those kinds of arrangements. But as you can see today, even in the telephone industry, you have very few companies: Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile. In my time, back in the mid 70s and up to I think 1980, it was just AT&T, only AT&T, and AT&T was essentially a monopoly. But now you have Verizon, you have AT&T, you have Sprint and T-Mobile, um, and they account for more than 85% of all sales in the United States of cellular communications. So really, that industry is an example of monopoly, except that now there's some kind of a competition between them I remember when AT&T was forced to break up, um, they, when they were forced to break up, um, they got into some kind of a competition with each other because AT&T was now broken into different companies. Verizon is just a new name. Forgotten, I think it was not Western Bell. Um, and then they had Western Bell. I don't even think that Western Bell exists anymore. Maybe they changed their name to Sprint, and then T-Mobile. And they control uh, the telecommunication industry. Now, essentially, the firms in an oligopoly are not exactly examples of perfect competition. I mean, in perfect competition, like monopolistic competition, they are not. Because in monopolistic competition, there are still many firms, and the barriers to entry are highly limited, and firms can come in and leave the industry very, very freely. Uh, Essentially, what happens in an oligopoly is that each seller knows what the other one is doing because um, they're easy to identify who the competitors are, and they react to changes to each other's moves. So there's quite a bit of how would you call it, a cat and mouse game among them. Okay. Uh, and like you see here, there's this kind of strategic mutual dependence. They depend on each other and they watch each other's moves. Okay, why is it, how does a oligopoly occur? Again, barriers to entry, technology, control of resources, and even the size of the market that makes it such that you have to produce a certain minimum to survive, given the market price of goods. And of course, mergers and acquisitions. And this is why America has a, antitrust policies, so that companies don't go and acquire each other. And in the end, what they have, you inadvertently allow oligopolies to arise. And this is why before a company is allowed to acquire another one, the government tries to ensure that the outcome would not be a limitation of competition. And so this is why you have antitrust policies and antitrust um, agencies in the United States that must approve mergers by large companies. Okay. Unless there is in the interest of the society, the community, for one company to acquire another. For example, a company that is failing, is running out of business, especially in the banking industry, you see mergers and acquisitions quite often, so that people do not lose confidence in the banking system. Okay. And mergers can be vertical mergers, they can be horizontal mergers. Vertical mergers is, for example, when a company, let us say a company that bakes bread, acquires a company that makes flour for baking bread. And so that's kind of a vertical merger. Okay. And then horizontal mergers are where companies producing, selling something similar get together. And that's a horizontal merger. Okay, and there are different ways of measuring oligopoly, and this is why when governments have the antitrust policies, will calculate these ratios in order to approve the merger of firms, so as not to limit competition in the market. There are different kinds of indexes. This Huddersfield-Spindle Index is used as a measure of concentration in a market, and which drives policy approval of policy. Okay, so this is it, a summary of the lecture, and which is what you need to read. I sent a message that one or more students have taken the final exam. The final exam is not yet officially posted, and so you cannot take it now because I'm still in the process of developing final exam fully. So please, until the final exam is officially posted, do not go and take the final exam. I've actually blocked the final exam so that nobody else can take it. And those who have taken it, I will open what you took the finals week. And it's possible that I'm just going to make it something for extra credit, maybe maximum 5 points. But I am developing something like a 50-point final exam that will be posted properly. I might change my mind, don't get me wrong, might add to the questions and rearrange the exam. Okay. Having said that, the question is, does anybody have any questions? And before you ask your questions, we do apologize. I totally forgot to post the last office hour we had. Totally forgot to post this, so I'm going to post both of them before the end of the day tomorrow. Today's and the one for last week. Okay, so I'm done. Do you have any questions for me?
Yes, sir.
All right.
I know we had, I know a couple of us have had some trouble downloading the critique, the news, the article critiques. I'm
Mhm.
still having trouble. And I was able to get the first one, but I'm not able to get two and three. Is there a way that you can repost it, like you did in announcements, or
Absolutely. I'm going to check on them. Uh, sometimes they're not accessible to students. I don't know why they have that technical problem. I will
yeah?
download it myself and just post it as an email or something like that. I've
Okay,
made a note
appreciate
that
that.
I'm going to do that after this.
Okay. And then last question is, when is everything due? Do you have a specific date? I think we asked that before, but I can't remember. I'm sorry.
Everything should be due after the last week of class. Like today is Tuesday, and everything should be due no later than Wednesday next week. Because that next week, Tuesday, will be our last lecture, I believe. Yes, that is Unit 7. And maybe by Friday, I can make it that way.
Professor, is there any way that we may see what our grades are right now so we see how we're doing in the class? Because right now
Let me
there's
say
nothing.
first of all that everybody seems to be doing very well, but I'm going to figure that out. I don't know. I mean, from semester to semester, it kind of change what happens, but I'm going to go in and release what your averages are, so at least you can see how you're doing. At least you see it for yourself, see how things are going. But I've graded all the assignments, and I'm surprised that you're not able to see your average. If, in the grade book, you should be able to see that.
It's not showing anything. It's just showing blank in the grade book.
Oh, okay, I'm going to fix that. I'm going to fix it. I'll make a note for myself. It should shoot by the end of the day tomorrow. All right. Any other questions? Okay, hearing none. I'm glad you all came, and thanks very much for coming. So I look forward to seeing you this time next week, Tuesday.
All right. Have a great weekend, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, brother.
See
Thank you,
everybody.
Professor.